I am Keith Elliott. I am the Scottish Borders Archaeology Officer, taking over from Chris Bowles in 2019 as the Archaeology Officer for Scottish Borders Council. So hopefully I might become a bit of a known to you in time, but for some I guess I might be an unknown. We have a number of speakers this afternoon again, with the starting of John Reid and Stuart Campbell to talk about Newstead, hopefully showing that there is still much to learn about what might be thought of as a known site of South East Scottish archaeology. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Keith, and thanks to the organisers for inviting us to come along and tell you about our favourite site. What we're going to do, we'll do a double header this afternoon, but I'm only going to do a very small portion of this. I'm going to hand over to Stuart Campbell, who many of you will know is Professor of Archaeology in Manchester, but he's also one of our trustees at Trimontium and an absolute stalwart of our community archaeology project. So I'll hand over to Stuart shortly. We've been very, very busy over the last year. We're almost punch-drunk with all the things that are going on. The museum itself has taken up a lot of our time and effort. The Trimontium Museum in Melrose, we've quadrupled our visitor numbers over the last 2 years, and that's meant quite a large programme of work for our volunteers. And in addition to that, in February of this year, we started building our community archaeology building, which sticks out the back of the museum, and it was completed on time and just under budget in July. So, yes, I thought we might invite the Edinburgh trams people down to visit us. So anyway, we're running several projects all at the one time. But what you're going to hear about this afternoon is something about our geophysics. And the last time that I spoke to you, which was with Chris before he went off to America, the last time that we spoke to you was about Torwood Lee, and I'm just going to segue into the geophysics at Newstead by mentioning something about Torwood Lee at the start, and that's going to be my little slot. As most of you know, Stuart Piggott dug this in 1950, and it was an absolute peach of a site. Here you had somewhere where you've got a broch planked right in the corner of a much earlier hill fort, and the broch is absolutely filled with Roman material, raising all sorts of questions, and then the destruction of the broch itself being particularly interesting. And for those of you that don't know the site, it's well worth a visit. It sticks up on the hill immediately behind Galashiels. And a couple of years ago, RGK, the Roman commission, the Iron Age Commission in Germany, came over and did some geophysics with us at the site. And when we spoke about this the last time, we kind of glossed over this slide quite quickly because we had a lot to get through. But I just wanted to revisit it in the next couple of minutes because, as you can see here, you can see the fortifications of the hill fort. You can see the broch stuck in the corner of that. They were able to identify Piggott's previous trenches on the magnetometry, but we kind of glossed over the broch itself. I want to just focus on that because you can see that when you increase the resolution and the detail, that's the foundations of the broch. But this area of extreme magnetic disturbance is actually the ditch round about the broch, and the broch had its own ditch which cut into the earlier hill fort ditch. And there was a lot of puzzling over why this was so dramatic. And the report eventually came through. It was after the last conference. The report eventually came through that what we're looking at almost certainly is highly magnetized tumble of stone from the superstructure of the broch, and it's been pushed into the ditch at some point. And if we go back one, you can see that the broch floor had been cleaned out by the 1892 excavation of the Gala Ramblers, who I think had excavated it the first time round. It was reported on by Curl in one of his early papers. And then it was subsequently cleaned out again by Pigott. So there's virtually no burned material in the floor of the Broch. But if you go back and read the original report, there was at least a 2 or 3 inch layer of ash right across the floor that was all subsequently taken away. And almost certainly what's happened here is that this Broch joins that succession of Brochs that have undergone what they call a fiery termination. Here, this is David Simon's nice painting. This is Castle Craig Broch, supposedly here. But you can see that if the superstructure of the Broch, the wooden superstructure of the Broch was burned, the upper floors, the upper half or 2/3 of the Broch, stonework, will have become magnetised, and it's that's been tossed into the ditch when the Broch has been abandoned. So that's just a little revisit of a little bit of the magnetometry that's gone on in the area. But Stuart, who's going to speak to us now, is going to take you through what we've been doing recently with others at Newstead itself.
Right, thank you. So yeah, nipping a little bit further east, past Melrose to Newstead. Let me get the controls working. There we are. So the main features at Newstead, most prominently attention's focused on Trimontium, the Roman fort that went through several phases up there with its attached annexes. But it's worth emphasising, and I'll come back to the fact that it's part of a much wider archaeological landscape, notably formed by all these temporary camps, but also Iron Age settlements in the vicinity as well. So what we've been doing really is starting to take episodes of geophysics investigation that have been working out from the fort site itself, but starting to take a more landscape archaeology-based approach. And a lot of that wider landscape is particularly known by crop marks. And there's a long series of images, all sorts of articles written, drawing on that quite heavily. And the fort itself has obviously been excavated on several occasions. Principally by James Carroll just over 100 years ago with his monumental publication in 1911. And in terms of the fort itself, it is actually that publication that's still the primary way that we understand the layout within the fort, despite the fact that a huge amount centres on this one plan. We don't really know where he excavated. We don't know how many walls were interpolated. We don't know what might remain there. And we know surprisingly little about threats to the site and whether the site, which has been under the plough for many decades, whether the site has actually suffered destruction or is in danger of suffering destruction. So there are a lot of reasons why it's interesting to use geophysics in that context, both to get a better understanding of what's going on within the fort, but also to place it in a more landscape context. And there have been a series of geophysics investigations. I'm not really going to say anything about the Newstead Environs project here that carried out both magnetometry and resistivity in the 1990s, or late 80s, early 1990s. But I'll be talking about the RGK magnetometry in 2018, and first of all, a ground-penetrating radar survey conducted by AOC in February, March last year. With both of these, there is still a lot of interpretation that's ongoing, and for various reasons I won't go into. Some of it we're only getting all of the detail that we really need to work with at about this point. There we are. It's worth saying that we're using it for a number of different reasons. Some of it obviously is to understand the Roman exploitation of the landscape, but equally it's important to use it as a way of understanding what Carroll was up to and where he was up to it. So in a sense, part of what we're looking at is what did Carroll actually excavate? It's the archaeology of archaeologists, which I think is great fun, but not everyone might share my enthusiasm for that. And slightly retrospectively, we're taking these phases of geophysics, together with previous work as well, and building it into an ongoing community archaeology project that at the moment is taking a much more landscape approach to the whole complex of activity going on around Newstead. And I want to end on a point that's starting to link that through to some of the other field work that's ongoing there, but we'll see if there's time by the time I get there. So if we start with the ground-penetrating radar survey that was carried out by OC, with Kate and Jimmy particularly leading on that, they did a couple of different bits of geophysics, and I'm going to be very selective in what I deal with. There just isn't time to deal with all the complexity. But the major area I'm going to be concentrating on is the part of the fort that was captured by a towed array in quite phenomenal detail. Being able to get a resolution of 8 centimeters or so is almost ridiculous. And it may not still be the case, but at the time this was done, I think it was the largest survey of that type that had been done in Britain. So the part of the fort recovered was really this central portion up here, running north to south, just clipping the main gate through the rampart down here, running across the central portion, bringing in the Principia, granaries and so on. We did do other stuff down towards the bathhouse that I'm not going to say anything about whatsoever. I've just flipped that carefully at 90 degrees just to confuse you, but north is to the right. And what I'm going to do is just play an animation that's starting at the surface of the field and going down to about 2 meters depth and then it'll come up again. And as it runs, you'll see archaeological features swimming into view, disappearing, swimming back into view. But you'll get an idea of the sometimes quite astonishing resolution that we've got coming from that. So if we just started playing, if you look at the depth at the right-hand side, you can see how deep in the ground it is, and you start to see the buildings coming out, the Principia there at the centre, the Commandant's house on the left, the fort wall at the far left-hand side. It really is quite astonishing, the level of details there. We've just about reached the bottom of it. The archaeology has dropped out and it'll start pulling out again. So you can see it all happening again if you missed it the first time round. But these vague ghostly lines, that's what Carl excavated. Showing up particularly clearly if there are any stone foundations, stone wall bases still surviving, cobbled surfaces, stuff like that. Earth differentiations not picking up nearly as clearly. But it gives an absolutely fantastic record that can then be the basis of all sorts of other things. And I just want to highlight a couple of those other things. And we'll start with actually what happens immediately underneath the plough soil. It says 20 centimetres, it's actually really about the top half metre. We don't see very much difference. What you see there isn't so much building plans. What you see are these areas of noise, and they are of noise. There are lots of small objects, voids, rubble, big potsherds, stuff like that showing up that surround squarish open spaces. It's a little bit clearer if I highlight the rubbly areas that surround those squarish open spaces. And if we drop Carl's plans on that, you can see down in the lower half of it, those spaces between the noise nicely frame the buildings that he excavated. So the buildings that are slightly lower depth, they're deeper down. But I think what we're looking at predominantly is the outlines of Carl's trenches. It's not completely clear because some of these lines seem to be following the main roadway running through the site. But because they're predominantly occurring above the wall levels, I think it's much more likely that's an excavated part of the site. So for about the first time, we're really getting an overall idea of what Carl opened up within Newstead itself. But there are bits of this that are quite disturbing because the depth on this is immediately below the plough soil. So the sorts of stuff we're getting there, sitting at the base of the plough soil, and if the plough's eating into underlying archaeological deposits, it's immediately going to be causing destruction. And in these areas of more variegated signals, these pink areas, you also get quite a lot of wall lines surviving. Not surprisingly, mainly in the areas that I think fall outside Karl's trenches. This is an area that Karl speculated that was the officers' quarters and complains about stone robbing and so on, destroying it before he could actually excavate it. So I think what's happening up there is that we've got intact archaeology, and considerable amount of it that Karl didn't excavate, but it's probably of quite imminent threat if the plough is steadily eating into the underlying archaeology. So there's an area both of interest, but an area of some concern in there as well. Second area I want to look at is just an example of what we can do and what we can see in terms of Karl's excavations in the area around the Principia in here at the middle. So if we switch to doing an overlay over Karl's plan, this is the layout as I've been able to georectify his original plan against the site as it is now. That's the area that AOC did their ground penetrating radar. That is the level at 1 meter's depth where these walls really start to show up quite clearly. And you can start to see the Principia showing up quite clearly, row of rooms here with subdivisions exactly as he excavated them, and the granary to the north showing up nice and clearly. If we zoom in a bit and then overlay that with a tracing of Karl's plan, you can see there's a little bit of offsetting. So the distribution, the map of buildings on the site is possibly slightly out, and with surveying technology of over 100 years ago, that would be entirely understandable. And to be honest, the next stage is going to be try and refine the rectification of his plan using the information about the underlying buildings that we can now see. And I think we'll be able to pull them in quite tightly together. As I say, you've got the granary up there. Some of the features are showing up very clearly, like this wall line that's subdivided. You've got some areas inside that probably are rubble backfill that was perhaps put in when he excavated the trenches. And if we switch the underlying geophysics, you can see as you move across it, the walls on the south of it now snap into focus a good deal more sharply. But what's also interesting is you can see things like this, that seems to be very definitely structural, that's lurking outside the trench that Karl excavated. So we can start to see parts of that structure that are associated with the back of the Principia that's got details that we didn't know about as well. It's maybe also worth saying when I'm on this image that one of the big questions at Newstead is obviously the pits, because so much amazing material was preserved in them. The first pit, pit number 1, is actually just in here. It's very difficult to see on the ground penetrating radar, but you can make it out. And I think it's one of the areas where we need to look at the data in greater depth to see if we can refine our understanding of earth-cut features. And okay, it had an altar, it had a couple of skeletons, it had all sorts of Roman stuff in there. But according to Karl, he backfilled it with what he described as modern rubbish. So you'd still expect it to have quite a lot of material that you might hope would show up on geophysics, but it doesn't seem to. So there's all sorts of details that we'll need to explore in there. But I want to switch at this point to the other survey, the magnetometry survey that was carried out by Ruth Busing from RGK in 2018. It's magnetometry, so it's picking up on a different type of geophysical signal in the soil. So it's going to be much better, possibly, at picking up ditches, earth-cut features than the ground-penetrating radar, but everything's squashed in together, so you're not getting that depth differentiation that we get with ground-penetrating radar. Again, it's towed array, it covered an area of about 35 hectares or so. If you know Newstead, it's basically the area to the north of the Melrose bypass. So it's covering large areas. You can see the fort clearly in here. In terms of the features within the fort, you can see quite a lot of them showing up, but not nearly as clearly as with the ground-penetrating radar. And it'd be quite worrying if that wasn't the case. But in fact, things like the fort ditches show up rather more clearly, it seems, in the magnetometry data. And you can see lots of nice features in the annexes around it, but I want to focus more over in this direction to give you an idea of the sorts of things that are showing up. First thing that shows up quite clearly in this area are the ditches of lots of the marching camps. And there are probably at least 8 different temporary camps in the vicinity of Newstead. And what becomes clear with these is to some extent just how much they start to overlie each other. And it looks as though in at least a couple of cases there may well be ditch recuts and renovations. So you're not necessarily simply talking about a single event creating a camp, but that the camp may have gone through several phases itself. But even once you pull them out, the area is full of all sorts of other interesting linear features, some of which may easily be post-Roman in date. Some of the stuff around down here almost looks like a bit of a field system, or it might be parts of marching camps that we haven't picked up on aerial photograph previously. There's interesting stuff going on here where you get more rounded, curvilinear sorts of features, where possibly you might think, is there an Iron Age settlement that perhaps predated the fort? And indeed, in the area of the marching camp, the Bradford team excavated at Red Rig, which is a circular Iron Age enclosure. And what's most individually most intriguing is this lovely circular feature down here, which is something like 30, 35 meters across, pretty much circular. It's got a continuous feature, so some sort of trench running around it, but you seem to have isolated posts within it as well. And that's possibly a gyrus. Horse training centre, and that's the only other known one in a Roman fort at the Lunt near Coventry. So there could be something quite exciting in there, and the way it's cut through by some of these other linear features, it'd be a really interesting area to target for a bit of excavation, but maybe sometime in the future. Okay, just before I finish, I wanted to tie that together with a mention of some of the things that we're merging this into as an ongoing project, where we're doing things like multispectral drone imaging to try and get better definition on the sorts of features that have shown up through crop marks. We're hoping to expand the geophysics cover to the south of the Melrose bypass to pick up other areas of marching camps, look at other potential extramural features that might be contemporary with the fort. And we're doing an extensive program of field walking. And I just wanted to touch very briefly on the field walking, because it's got similar sorts of aims. In terms of understanding Roman land use, it's really going to get interesting as we move away from the fort. However, so far we've really concentrated in the fort area, because the landowner is very kindly taking the fort out of active cultivation for a few years to give us a chance to evaluate things. So mostly what we've been doing with the field walking is charting in loving detail where you get lots of artifacts on the surface because we're in Curle's backfill. And that itself is quite useful to understand where he was excavating. But I just want to highlight something much more recent, which almost tragically is the most exciting thing for me that's come out of the field walking, which is a distribution of post-medieval ceramics, and by that I'm really meaning stuff that's 19th, early 20th century. And there's a fair amount of it scattered around the place, most of it down towards Newstead village at this end, a little bit along the field edge. That basically people in Newstead spent a lot of time chucking stuff away. That's fine. But that gives you an idea of where rubbish was being disposed of. in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's really interesting to contrast that with one particular distribution of material from that period, which is a distribution of clay pipe fragments, which doesn't follow that pattern. You do get plenty at the Newstead end,